they didn't get to the root of the problem, so the same problem kept on happening. You may have heard me before use the illustration of paper mulberry trees. I have paper mulberry trees in my yard, and I hate them. Scientific fact, the roots of paper mulberry trees go all the way to hell. Paper mulberry trees, if you're not familiar with them, they grow up like little sprigs, but if you leave them and don't cut them or kill them, they'll grow into this huge chunk tree that's fibrous inside. And even if you have a chainsaw, which I've used many times to try to cut these things down, it'll burn through chainsaw blades before you finally get that paper mulberry trees down. And even after you kill it, it'll start springing up again and again and again. Because if you don't kill those roots, they keep on coming back. Israel didn't deal with their roots, and oftentimes we don't deal with the root of the problem ourselves. You've ever known those that have a friend group, maybe, or a social group? Maybe it's at a job or in churches or just in their normal social life. And they're in that group for a little while, something blows up, and they forsake all those people that they knew, find a new group, and then that blows up after a while. They forsake all them, and it's always the other people that did something wrong to them, not realizing the root of the problem they never dealt with, themselves, ourselves. That's why we keep returning to some of the same sins over and over and over again, because we're not dealing with the real issue. We're dealing with the symptoms. We're maybe plucking up some of the paper mulberry leaves, but we're not dealing with the roots that are underneath. So, Israel had just been through a civil war. Benjamin did absolute evil. They were going the way of Sodom, so the rest of the Israelites, as we saw in the last chapter, rose up and conquered over the tribe of Benjamin. But now a problem arises, because there's not enough wives and women after this war for Benjamin to continue. There has to be a certain amount in that population to be viable so that population growth can keep happening. The danger is there are these 12 tribes, land allotments there. If Benjamin is wiped from the face of the earth, what happens to that land? They have no directive from God. They have no direction there, causing further civil war down in the future of who gets to claim right over this. And so let us read this chapter this morning, starting in verse 1 of Judges 21. Now the men of Israel had sworn at Mizpah, "No one of us shall give his daughter in marriage to Benjamin." This is before the war. Verse 2 is after the war. And the people came to Bethel and sat there till evening before God, and they lifted up their voices and wept bitterly. And they said, "O Lord, the God of Israel, why has this happened in Israel? That today there should be one tribe lacking in Israel." And the next day the people rose early and built there an altar and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. And the people of Israel said, "Which of all the tribes of Israel did not come up in the assembly of the Lord? For they have taken a great oath concerning him who did not come up to the Lord to Mizpah, saying, He shall surely be put to death." And the people of Israel had compassion for Benjamin, their brother, and said, "One tribe is cut off from Israel this day. What shall we do for the wives of those who are left, since we have sworn by the Lord that we will not give any of our daughters for wives?" And they said, "What one is there of the tribes of Israel that did not come up to the Lord to Mizpah?" And behold, no one had come to the camp from Jabesh Gilead to the assembly. And when the people had mustered, behold, no one of the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead was there. So the congregation sent 12,000 of their bravest men there and commanded them, "Go and strike the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead with the edge of the sword, also the women and the little ones. This is what you shall do. Every male and every woman who is slain by a male you shall devote to destruction." And they found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had not known a man by lying with him. And they brought them to the camp at Shiloh. And this is the land of Canaan. When the whole congregation sent word to the people by Benjamin, who were at the rock of Rimmon, and proclaimed peace to them, and Benjamin returned at that time, and they gave them the women whom they have saved alive from the women of Jabesh Gilead, but they were not enough for them. And the people had compassion on Benjamin, because the Lord had made a breach in the tribes of Israel. And the elders of the congregation said, "What shall we do for wives for those who are left, since the women are destroyed out of Benjamin?" And they said, "There must be an inheritance for the survivors of Benjamin, that a tribe not be blotted out from Israel. Yet we cannot give them wives from our daughters, for they, people of Israel, had sworn, 'Cursed be the one who gives a wife to Benjamin.' So they said, 'Behold, there is a yearly feast to the Lord at Shiloh, which is north of Bethel, on the east of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem, the south of Lebonah. And they commanded the people of Benjamin, saying, Go and lie in ambush in the vineyards and watch. If the daughters of Shiloh come out to dance the dances, then come out of the vineyards and snatch each man his wife from the daughters of Shiloh and go to the land of Benjamin. And when the fathers of their brothers come to complain to us, we will say to them, Grant them graciously to us, because we did not take for each man of them his wife in battle, neither did you give them to them, else you would now be guilty. And the people of Benjamin did so, and took their wives according to their number, from the dancers whom they carried off. Then they went and returned to their inheritance, and rebuilt the towns who lived in them. And the people of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family, and they went out from every man to his inheritance. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So, verse 1 shows us something that happened before they went to the civil war in Benjamin. They made at Mizpah was the rally point where all of the Israelites gathered together against Benjamin, and they gave a vow. They said, No one of us shall give his daughter in marriage to Benjamin. We won't give any of our daughters to be married to that wicked tribe. Now, it was very clear in the last chapter that God told them to go against Benjamin and to fight against them. It does not say that God told them to make this kind of oath. He never commanded that. At least we don't have a record of him commanding that. Sometimes we need to be careful in our zealousness to fight evil and stand for righteousness, that we don't overstep and end up harming ourselves and others by rashly vowing things. Sometimes in our anger, we can make statements that are broad, too broad, and it ends up hurting us in the end. We need to calm ourselves down before we start making big statements. They didn't think about the ramifications of what that would mean if they won. Now, our confession in the Bible talks about lawful oaths and unlawful oaths. So an oath is something that is given to one another with God as a witness. So, for instance, when I was in the Army, we had an oath of enlistment that was made to other people to defend the Constitution. That's opposed to a vow, which is made to God alone, such as wedding vows. You actually think you're telling it to each other. No, you're telling it to God. And so there's oaths and vows, and these are good. These are lawful acts of worship, actually, that give a pledge, a surety that, no, I swear, as you do in a courtroom, that what I am saying is true, and so you don't have to parse someone's words. They, however, gave an oath. We need to be careful with our oaths and with our vows, that they're actually things that God commands us to, or God is pleased with. In our confession, it talks about those who make monastic priestly vows of poverty and celibacy for all their life, which is not something the Bible ever commands of people to do. In fact, it condemns those who forbid marriage. If you unlawfully vow something, it's an invalid vow, invalid oath. And we also need to not give rash oaths. I once knew a man, and I think he was trying to do it for his health. Don't give an oath to God for dietary stuff, for your diet, okay? And he said, and he gave a vow to God that he was never going to eat at fast food ever again. Well, that worked out for a little while, but he was a man that drove for his occupation, and that can be very hard and taxing. And so I remember riding with him one time, and he said, well, I'm going to go to this place. It was this little mom and pop shop place where you could walk in. So it wasn't a drive-through. Well, okay, for him that wasn't technically fast food, so it was okay to go ahead and do that. And that lasted for a little while. And until we started to get to, well, he's really busy and he needs to get to this next stop. And Wendy's, in his mind, had a better value of the quality of meat, so that wasn't technically fast food either, kind of bending this vow to himself until one day he finally just went through a McDonald's drive-thru, got a quarter pounder. Then he felt all the shame and the guilt that he broke his vow. Beloved, there are enough actual sins in the Bible for us to have guilt and shame and need to repent over, that we don't need to make up new ones with unlawful vows and oaths that God never asks us to do. So, In verse 2, they wept bitterly, and they cried as the consequences of their oath set in and what this meant. Before they were angry and outraged at Benjamin and would for their complete destruction. But now, after the dust is settled, they realize once again that even in Benjamin's vile wickedness, Benjamin is still their brother. And their oath means that Benjamin will vanish, that the 12 tribes of Israel will become the 11 tribes of Israel. People in Judges, you see, had a problem with oaths. We've seen quite a few of them. Perhaps the most striking was Jephthah, who made that rash vow regarding his own daughter. While an oath or a vow is a valid practice for us in the New Covenant, we must guard against rash and unthoughtful oaths. An oath is not something flippantly done, nor should it be commonly done. Rather, let your yes be yes and your no be no, as Jesus tells us. We don't have to vow an oath for everything. The traditional marriage vow ceremony says it is not something to be entered into unadvisedly or lightly, but reverently, discreetly, advisedly, soberly, and in the fear of God. And the same could be said for all vows that we take. Oddly, chapter 19, remember chapter 19 with the Levite and his concubine and the horrors that happened to her, had no mention of God at all. Chapter 20, God is very active. It tells us, God telling the people of Israel to do certain things. Here in chapter number 21, there are people mentioning God, people using God as an excuse for what they're doing, but no word or command from God is ever present. God doesn't speak. There's people speaking for God. Well, God did this, so therefore we're going to do this. We need to be careful that we don't use God language as a cover-up for our own sin, not dealing with the root of our problem. Sometimes we say, well, I prayed and God told me this, in order to go against what God may actually want you to do. Or, you know what, I have peace about it, as if peace about it makes something that is sinful, unsinful all of a sudden. Never use God as an excuse to justify your own desires. I once knew of a woman who felt the call to be a missionary. That's a great godly call. Fantastic. Her husband did not feel that call. Throughout the course of their marriage, she decided, well, if you're not going, God told me to do this thing. Therefore, she divorced her husband and went into the mission field. Sinning to serve God is not serving God. God will lead you out of sin, never into it, no matter how much God language you wrap around whatever it is you're doing. We need to be very careful not to be Christianized in our language sometimes. For instance, in our disgruntledness or desire to spread gossip and to amass for ourselves our own factions, we can use words like, well, I'm just trying to seek counsel. We need to be careful that we're dealing with the root of our problem, not merely the leaves and ramifications of it. So in verse 5, the question now comes, how do we give wives to Benjamin? When we have vowed not to give wives to Benjamin, what's the solution here? Well, the first reasonable solution, reasonable in air quotes, so if we can't give them from our women, well, then we'll give them other people's women. That makes sense. They made a great oath when all the people were assembled to cleanse the evil of Benjamin, and that anyone who didn't fight, he surely shall be put to death. And so they figure, well, if these people already are worthy of death, then why don't we go ahead and kill them and take their women? For such people would be complicit in Benjamin's crime is why they were worthy of that death. So they ask, okay, so are there any people that didn't help us? We can go to them. It so happens the town of Jabesh-Gilead had sent no people to aid Israel in the civil war. So in verse 10 through 14, they sent 12,000 of their bravest men and swarmed the city. They took from the conquest-era playbook of Joshua and devoted the men and almost every woman to destruction. We have to remember that the text is ambiguous here. And while Joshua had a clear command for such actions in the book of Joshua, here it's left more vague. It's made for us to wrestle. with this solution. Regardless, they got a bunch of women to be wives for Benjamin, 400 women, in fact. That gives them a significant amount of the way there, but it's still not enough supply for the continuation of the tribe. Benjamin is still going to eventually die out. So how do we make up the difference? What do we do about this? Well, verses 15 through 18, we see they concoct a second plan to supplement these wives. By the way, this is a terrible principle to go about your dating life with, okay? Don't go to Judges chapter number 21 to find out how to get a spouse. That's bad news. They state the problem again. We don't want to give Benjamin to die out. They have compassion, it even says on Benjamin. That's a good quality. But our oath says we can't give any wives to them. So they have a real problem. A tribe might be blotted out. They have the right intention. They don't want them to be blotted out. They want to have mercy on Benjamin. But they have the wrong solution, as we're about to see, which is to twist their oath so as to make it meaningless. Just like saying that Wendy's is not a fast food place. Many times we can have a real problem and right intention, but the wrong solution, the wrong way to fix the problem. As the old saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The problem is that we think our intentions are not tainted by the fall. We think that our heart sometimes cannot be corrupt and that we cannot gauge how pure our thoughts and our intentions always are. In fact, most of our intentions are mixed with selfishness, even our good ones. We may see someone struggling or in trouble with a real problem. We may intend to help them, but then we go and ask for prayer to a brother and sister and fall into gossip. We can fall into slander by simply seeking counsel from others that really don't need to hear whatever the story is. Scripture is our guide. No matter how good our intentions are, if we are not following how God commanded us, then we are in sin. Verse number 19 through 24, here's the plan. They don't have enough women. We vowed not to give them. Well, what if we don't technically give them? They decided to stretch the intention of the oath. You see, there was a festival at Shiloh that was held every year, and people would send their daughters along the road up to Shiloh, which was where the worship was happening, to dance and play instruments. And so it's like you'd walk into Shiloh, and leading you there were all the daughters of the people that were dancing and having a celebration as you walked by them. So the great advice is, what if we don't actually give our daughters? Why don't you just kidnap our daughters? If you take them, then we're not giving them. They tell Benjamin to lie in ambush and snatch the women that come to dance as they go by. And if any fathers or brothers come to you and complain, well, then you can tell them, well, you didn't technically give them to us. And if you did give them to us, then you're an oath breaker, so they're ours now. It's a strategy of eye winking. It's, I'm not supposed to give you this thing, but I'm going to just set it on the table and look the other way, and if you take it, you take it. If this is how they're going to treat vows, then the vow is practically irrelevant. Likewise, if we treat God's commands this way, to try to find loopholes and get-arounds, then the Scriptures are in practice irrelevant to you too. The root of the problem that they didn't ever solve in all of Judges, and why it kept on reoccurring, is found in verse 25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It was the height of moral relativism. It seems good to me. I feel my intentions are good, and therefore, I can do whatever I want to do. So you may ask, what was the solution to Benjamin and the wives? How should they, after this oath they gave and the risk of Benjamin being destroyed? Surely a tribe in Israel being eradicated would be terrible. And the fact is, I don't know. They got themselves into a moral quandary, a mess. But finding a solution to their problem isn't actually the point of this chapter. The point of this chapter, this closing chapter, is to once again illustrate that everyone did what was right to themselves. Whatever we think of this chapter and however we interpret it, it must be seen through this lens. God is illustrating for us that even after the wickedness to the level of Sodom has been righteously fought against and eradicated, Israel's root problem is still there. We've seen over and over again. In fact, 13 times in a row, Israel falling into idolatry, worshiping other gods, foreign powers overtaking them, and God sending a judge to save them again and again. That pattern of idolatry, oppression, salvation, idolatry, oppression, salvation, idolatry, oppression, salvation. Does that sound like your Christian life? If so, it is because you have the same root problem that they did. You have no king over you, and you're doing what's right in your own eyes. We need to do the hard work of finding the root of the problem. You wonder why you have a besetting sin that always keeps coming up over and over again? It's because you're dealing with the symptoms in repentance, and you're not digging down into the roots to get it up. It's why we turn to sin rather than turning to God. And everyone has a different thing that's that besetting sin that keeps coming up. Is it unjust anger? It's not just, Lord, forgive me, I flew off the handle and I got angry. Why did you get so violently angry to begin with? Get to the root of the problem, and trust me, that is a hard thing to do, because now you're getting into your past and your history and your family history and your relationships and all that murky stuff that we really like to just kind of shove down. But if we never deal with the root, that same fruit's going to keep coming. Some deal with envy, and that's their go-to sin when things get stressful and hard, wishing what other people have had, or spirits of criticism, or lying and bending the truth, or lust, or resentment, or discontentment about their life. So, we need to root those things up, church. Do the hard work. And we don't have to do it alone. We can do that with each other, with good, trusted Christian brothers and sisters. So, coming to this last verse in Judges, how do we sum up this whole book? What do we take away from this as a church? I mean, it's been an odd, strange, weird book. We've seen brave men, and we've seen cowards. We've seen Gideon, who was a coward turned into a brave man. We saw the cunning of Ehud and his secret sword. We saw Shamgar's prowess with an ox goad. Deborah standing up when no man would. The housewife Jael slaying an evil king with the lure of milk and a place to sleep. Gideon winning with the prompting of God and an ingenious strategy. Abimelech being slain by a woman dropping a rock on his head. Jephthah, whose army was led by God himself. Samson, who for all of his faults and his dying breath decimated Philistines. We've also seen civil war, Israel turning against itself and falling into gross sin, and men raising to purify their people. Or, as Hebrews sums it up in Hebrews 11, what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, all people we've seen in Judges. Of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, who were made strong out of weakness, becoming mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised. They were still in the Old Testament. They were still awaiting the Messiah. We still have a reality that they never had, even though they went through all of this. And verse 40 in Hebrews 11, since God has provided something better for us. And get this, that apart from us, they shall not be made perfect. We complete the story of Judges. We complete the story of the entire Old Testament because from us and what God is doing in us in his new covenant work, indwelling believers, enacting the Great Commission, through us, we are verifying everything that they went through, all the faith they had in a future promise. We're living in that promise right now. That promise of Jesus Christ, his death, his resurrection, that took on sin and rose again from the dead. You see, Judges, believe it or not, is an example to us of faith. A faith that produces these things, but a faith given by God, a faith that delivers, a faith that saves even if our body is destroyed, a faith that presses on for something better, that trusts in what God has promised even if we have not yet received it. And as much as they had, God, it says in Hebrews, provided something better for us. For even these heroes can't be made perfect apart from us, apart from the coming of the people of the new covenant. You see, Judges isn't just a history of ancient Israel. It's our history. In this we see God's mercy. For while Judges shows the fall of people into moral anarchy, perhaps the most amazing fact of the book of Judges is that after all Israel has done, there even still is an Israel by the end of the book. God in his mercy has kept them even when they have strayed repeatedly. Their standing, no rational person can say, is due to them. It is due to God. They continued by nothing but the sheer mercy of God. If God so kept his people in the old covenant, which was temporary and passing away, how much more will he keep you, his people of the new covenant, which is eternal and will never pass away? This book is part of redemptive history, seeing what's leading up to Christ. And it's no coincidence that a book that stated the problem was that there was no king in Israel, the very next chronological book, 1 Samuel, as Ruth takes place during Judges, begins not with a king, but with a story of a woman about to give a miraculous birth granted by God, whose son is given to a priest who will grow up to be a prophet, who then will anoint a king. Even here, foreshadowing and figuring Jesus Christ, the prophet, priest, and king, born of a virgin. You see, the book of Judges isn't just about Israel. So prepare to hear something I don't usually say. It's about you. You see, Christ is fulfillment of the Mosaic law, the promised seed, and the one who will rise through Israel, the one through whom all the earth will be blessed. If Israel would have fallen in the book of Judges, there would have been no redemption for you. No continued covenant people, no King David, thus no Davidic covenant of an eternal throne, no shadow of the temple to which Jesus' work is the reality, no words of the prophet pointing to the Messiah, no lineage of Jesus making him the rightful heir. There would be no line of Judah if there was no Judah. When we read Judges, we are reading how God has worked in history to save you. And if that sounds amazing to you, that God would have you on his mind as his redeemed people, not only on the cross, he had you on his mind as we're reading verse by verse through the book of Judges. That God had you, his redeemed people, in the Old Testament book and from the very foundations of the world. So in closing, in this book of Judges, thinking about how much God has orchestrated for us, we can surely say, all things work together for good to them that love God. At this time, Pastor Skip is going to lead us in reflection and invitation based on what we've heard.